Russian affairs expert Fred Weir, who has covered Russia in depth. Fred, thank you so much for taking time to be with us here on Beyond World is One. Russia's deployment of hypersonic missiles. Talk to us about it. Will it trigger a new arms race? That's the big question.
They certainly are. I mean, we're certainly in a situation where it looks like the 1960s again. There's virtually no arms control. There's only one of many arms control agreements still standing. And the two sides, both the United States and Russia, are engaged in a crash programs of nuclear modernization. That's what they call it. And these hypersonic missiles, new ICBM, many new things that Russia is fielding are they're reminiscent of a breakthrough, the kind of breakthroughs we had in the past during the Cold War. But the Russians know that arms race during the Cold War bankrupted the country. It really was one of the main reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. They understand that they cannot match the United States in technical, financial, intellectual, industrial capabilities. They know that. So I think the Russian idea is we're going to just build a few weapons, enough to maintain our deterrent, and not engage in a big global arms race like we did before. But it's got to be a temptation. Every time one side does something, the other side feels it has to match that and surpass that. And this is the spiral, the kind of danger that faces us now.
All right, Fred Weir, our Russian affairs expert, joining us from Moscow in Russia. Fred, stay with us. We have a couple of more stories that we want to discuss with you. We also have China, Russia and Iran, who are currently engaged in a joint naval drill in the Gulf of Oman. But beyond the military cooperation, it's the political message that is of greater importance here. This joint drill comes at a time when Iran is locked in a fierce standoff with the U.S. Trump has slapped Iran with crippling sanctions, and there has been considerable personal animosity between the leaders on public platforms like Twitter. It's in this backdrop that Russia and China have decided to throw their weight behind Iran. Iran's Rear Admiral Gholamreza Tahani claimed that this exercise will show that Iran cannot be isolated on the world stage. On the face of it, this drill will involve rescuing ships on fire or vessels under attack by pirates and shooting exercises. Both Iran's Navy and the Revolutionary Guards Corps will take part. Iran's state media has dubbed it the new triangle of power in the sea. Russian and Chinese destroyers arrived at the Chabahar port in Iran and are taking part in the drill. China said that the drill was not necessarily connected to the regional situation and claimed that it was aimed at deepening exchange and cooperation between the navies of the three countries. The location of these joint drills are also of importance. The Gulf of Oman connects to the Strait of Hormuz, which is an essential cog in seaborne oil trade. Nearly 30% of global oil trade passes through here. And this was also a flashpoint earlier this year when multiple oil tankers were captured, leading to allegations by both the US and Iran against each other. Now, as an analyst, Fred, talk to us. How do you view the Russia-China-Iran military exercise in the tense Gulf region?
Well, in normal times, that's not such a big deal. Countries will combine, do naval drills, and so on. It doesn't mean they're allies or even friends. They just have some common purpose in a particular region. But right now in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, I mean, in the northern Indian Ocean, things are very tense. The United States is now putting more troops into Saudi Arabia. They've had their own naval drills recently with their allies. And there have been this series of attacks, on oil tankers and oil fields in Saudi Arabia. So it is a really dangerous situation. I believe the Russians and Chinese are doing this with Iran to show that Iran is not isolated, to try to counter all the American moves against Iran, the sanctions, this maximum pressure campaign. I think that the Russians and Chinese are doing this largely for propaganda purposes, to show the world that Iran has potential friends. It's sort of an escalation, and it's to be worried about. But probably, I mean, I believe those drills will end in 2 days, and there won't be any consequences from it.
Fred Weir, our Russian affairs expert, joining us from Moscow in Russia. For 2 decades now, Vladimir Putin has loomed large over Russian politics. A former KGB spy who took over the reins of Russia at the threshold of the 21st century. The name Putin has now become synonymous with Russia at the world stage. But this did not happen overnight. Let's now take you through some of the highs and lows of Russia's modern-day Tsar. We start from August 1999, when Russian President Boris Yeltsin named Putin, a little-known security officer, as his successor. But it was not without controversy. The announcement came amidst a slew of apartment bombings in Moscow by Chechen rebels. Putin took the opportunity to go on the offensive and pander to the nationalist sentiment. Very soon, Putin was not a nobody in Russian politics. In December that year, Yeltsin resigned as president, leaving Vladimir Putin to take over as acting president at the age of 47. In March 2000, Putin won his first presidential election and thus started his vice-like grip over Russian politics. His first term as president was quite challenging. This was the time when the Chechen rebels mounted a number of attacks on Russia. Chief among them was the Moscow theater hostage crisis. Almost 800 people were captured by the militants, and 170 people lost their lives. Nonetheless, Vladimir Putin romped to victory in 2004 with 70% vote share across the country. His first term had yielded improved standards of living for the people of Russia. And then, in December 2004, he took a very controversial step. Putin abolished elections to elect regional governors, essentially reducing them to Kremlin appointees. Putin had argued that the move would help unify Russia. The Russian economy did reasonably well in his second term, mainly due to oil exploration across the country. But Vladimir Putin ultimately had to give up his presidency in 2008 due to term limits on presidency. He handed over the post to his trusted deputy, Dmitry Medvedev, and took over as prime minister the very next day. Real power was always with Putin. In 2012, Medvedev called for Putin to return as president, and he obliged. For many people, Putin's third time was arguably the most eventful. In February 2014, as Ukrainians ousted pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, Vladimir Putin's forces moved in and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. What followed was a major international backlash, but Russia still controls Crimea and has even built a border separating it from Ukraine. And then in April 2014, rebels in eastern Ukraine, backed by Putin's Russia, revolted against Ukraine. The crisis resulted in millions of casualties. And just this month, Putin sat down with Ukraine's current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to iron out the differences. But all of these are trumped by what Putin did in September 2015. Putin sided with Syria's President Bashar al-Assad in his fight against the rebels. Russia helped change the tide of the war in Assad's favor. Even now, Russian warplanes are flying over the Idlib province of Syria, dropping bombs on what Syria calls as the rebel bastion. In November 2016, Putin once again courted controversy when Donald Trump came into office in the US. Russia was accused of interfering in the US presidential elections. What followed, of course, was a huge political storm that ended in the Mueller report. In March 2018, Putin was elected once again, and he will be in power until 2024. One highlight of his fourth term was the FIFA Men's World Cup, which was hosted by Russia in 2018. It was a major soft power coup for Putin. But in July 2019, Putin's throne was truly shaken by a mass protest in Moscow. Many independent candidates were denied permission to contest in the local body elections. Opposition leaders, including the popular Alexei Navalny, were detained. Navalny was even poisoned in his jail cell. But in true Putin fashion, the protests were eventually quelled. Moscow went quiet once again. Putin's career has been eventful to say the least. He hunts in the Siberian mountains, practices judo with professionals, and rides horses bare-chested in the wilderness. But beneath all of this is the meticulous, no-nonsense politician who, for many years, ruled Russia with utmost determination. And we still have our Russian affairs expert, Fred Weir, joining us from Moscow. Fred, Putin has completed 20 years in power. What, according to you, has been his biggest success and shortcoming during this 2 decades?
Well, there's no doubt that the first 2 terms that Putin was in power, basically 2000 to 2008, the Russian economy grew enormously. It wasn't just because of high oil prices. It was because the Russian state under Putin invested heavily in things like education and infrastructure, military renewal, a lot of the things that have made Russia successful in this decade. The foundations were laid in the previous decade by that economic expansion. And Russian living standards improved greatly. There was a boom in many industries. I could just mention that in the past, in the, say, 1980s, the Soviet Union was a huge importer of grain, wheat and rye and barley and so on. Now, Russia is the world's biggest exporter of grain. There's been this turnaround that Putin is, he's the president, so he takes credit for it, but it's really impressive in a lot of areas. Where he hasn't succeeded, in this decade anyway, is in creating terms for a new economic expansion. The Russian economy is growing. It's not going to collapse or anything that the West might have hoped when they slapped all those sanctions on it, but it can't achieve those high growth rates again, and at least not in the present system. Putin he has authored this huge infrastructure building program. There are a lot of bridges, roads, railways, airports being built around Russia, which he hopes will lead to an economic breakthrough. But right now, what Russian economy is in stagnation, and that's a bad sign. Putin's approval ratings are falling as a result, and it's not in crisis or anything like that, but this is his biggest challenge, certainly in the next 4 years.
All right, Fred, before we let you go, one last question. There's a simple one. Is there any significant challenger to Vladimir Putin in the short term?
Well, the answer in 2 seconds flat is no. Putin has created a system where he has no. There's a sort of a facade of democracy, but it doesn't promote genuine democratic competition. Therefore, no real competitors have emerged. And Putin, since he does seem to be a good steward of Russia's economy and foreign policy and so on, still enjoys fairly high approval ratings. So in the short term, certainly there is no challenge to Putin.
Fred Weir, our Russian affairs expert, joining us with that perspective from Russian capital, Moscow. Thank you, Fred, for being with us here on WION World.